Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We wanted to focus on some lessons to be gained from Surah Al-Masad, which was revealed in Mecca. And it said that this surah was revealed when there was open hostility to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we can see that Abu Lahab, which is the centerpiece of this surah, this chapter of the Quran, we can see that he had open hostility to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One of the things to focus on is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he gathered his people. In specific, there were people of prominence that he gathered together, and Abu Lahab, which was an uncle of his, he was gathered as well. But in this process, this gathering, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he called upon his standing with his people. So he told his people, if I were to tell you that there's an enemy that is descending upon you, to that effect, to destroy you, and everything that comes along with an enemy in the battlefield, so to speak, would you believe me? And in that regard, those who he had gathered, they affirmed that they would believe the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But then he gathered them and he told them that, and he moved from telling them that if this were the case, that an enemy would descend upon you, and if I were to inform you about this happening, that you would believe me. Then he started to talk to them about the hereafter and the destruction that is to come for those who don't believe, so to speak. At that point in time, Abu Lahab, he wished harm on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he left. He told them, this is what you called us for this? And so in that situation, you see how it is that the Prophet ﷺ was dealing with his people. In order for him to be able to use that approach, he had to have had a relationship with them. And I think that a lot of times, this is something that is missing from the da'wah, right? And I specifically am talking to those people who come into Islam and they come from cultures that are not Islamic at their root. This is a problem. Our task and our role in our communities is much different than that of a born Muslim. And until we get that together, we will never see progression of our people when it comes to the reality of Islamic teachings. What has become the case and what has become the norm for many of us is that it's easier for us to leave our communities and we become part of other communities. And it's easier for us to abandon the struggle of what it means to work through your own culture, to deal with your own family, with your own people. When that environment is not Islamic, we abandon that and we go into other communities and we become part of those communities. And we just imagine, we don't see that in this situation. Imagine if the Prophet ﷺ was to do that. That's not what took place here. The Quran is being revealed, Surah Al-Masad, and the introduction is clearly telling us that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he gathered his people and he had a standing with them. They knew who he was. Some of us, we are changing so much that we're not recognizable by our community. And that becomes an issue. It should be that we're not recognizable from the angle of bad habits. It should be that we're not recognizable from the angle of they don't know us to be one who's bringing destruction to the family, to the community, to our friends. But we should be recognizable as being those who are pillars in the community, those who are trustworthy, so on and so forth. And that's what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was. And that's a reality. It's very difficult to carry the da'wah in that regard. That's why you find that the early da'wah was such a burden. The da'wah that the Muslims were giving earlier on during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was weighty, it was hectic, it was not easy because they were in environments which challenged them. And the issue that we confront is that some of us will leave our communities for 20, 30 years, 40 years. You know, and I'm talking about real numbers, even 50 years. And we will have no impact on our communities at all. And part of that is because we have this understanding that we have to save ourselves. And we have this understanding that we have to leave our tribe, we have to leave our people, we have to leave our community. And what happens is that there's no representation of those values in our community because we left. And to make our way back becomes more and more difficult because we ourselves don't recognize ourselves and the community doesn't recognize us. And this is the story that we hear from a lot of people that have come into the deen. And so in this regard, the lessons that we get is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in order to share the truth of Islam, the benefits of Islam with the community, he had to have had a relationship with them. They have to know them. They have to know you. And that's the reality of the situation. He has to know them. They have to know you. Right? And so that's what we have seen, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he knew them. Right? And that's the same thing with you. They have to know you. Right? You have to know them. And so with this said, you know, it's going to be a challenge for many of us to continue in our growth as being Muslims if we don't take a different turn and a different orientation. And what we see is that people, after long periods of time and challenges, they confront that reality within themselves. They begin to see the challenges that they have gone through, and then they try to make it back to their own communities. And by that time, they've been beat up, right? And so they're kind of really going back into the community because they've been beat up and dealing with all of these situations. In other words, and I want to end on this note, we can't continue to run from ourselves. We can't run from ourselves and our own challenges. We can't run from ourselves and what goes on in our families. We can't run from ourselves and what goes on in our communities. And this is one of the biggest differences between what we saw in the 90s, the 80s, when it came to the idea of being a Muslim in the community, is that the Muslim was known as someone that would give back. There was some values that that person had that the community would identify with, and they believed that person to be beneficial to the community. We have completely lost that. And as a matter of fact, we have become detriments to the communities, right? And that has become an issue. And so there's no way, when we look at the introduction to Surah Al-Masad, there's no way that the Prophet ﷺ would have been able to gather those people and call them and tell them, who am I to you? Am I trustworthy or not trustworthy? Because he was known to be trustworthy before being designated to be a prophet. There was no way that he would be able to do that if he didn't have a standing with his people in his community. And I want to add a particular point before leaving because it's very essential and important. Some people, they created a lot of damage in their communities. They created a lot of breakdown. They created a lot of breakdown and damage in the community and in their families. And so it becomes difficult for them to orient themselves in that way. And it's understandable because there's a lot of reconfiguration, a lot of working things out, a lot of healing that has to take place. But if you did damage in your community, if you were a source of problems and violence in your community, if you were a source of the breakdown in your community, the self-righteous religious orientation, just because you changed it doesn't mean anything. You did damage in your community. So if you did damage in your community, if you broke down your community, then you have to orient yourself in such a way that you have to make amends with that community which you brought destruction to. You can't just sit there in the sense of now you've become religious and now it's self-righteous. The position that you take, like you're in a better position now, right, than where your community is at. That's a problem. Because religion is not supposed to be from the angle. That's a stage in your religious development. You were destructive in your community, right? And now you begin to change. What gives you the right to be self-righteous over your people? When maybe even your own people didn't reach that level of destruction that you reached, and that which you brought to your communities may be something that none of them that you judge to be so off, maybe none of them ever brought that level of destruction. And so we have to remove ourselves from this type of religious thinking, which is not really in sync with Islam. Because even those we find from the early Muslims who were destructive in their own communities, they went back and they made amends. And that's why the early generation was strong. Because they did take a position on certain things, but they didn't take a position to just abandon their families and their communities for the sake of doing so. They were forced out. If the deen was to maintain itself in Mecca as it was, the Muslims would have lived in that environment, and they would have tried to strive to be in that environment and work with those people from their community and their families and make it a better place. And that's just the work that many of us don't want to do, because it is taxing. It's the work of the prophets. This is why we find that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he suffered so much, because he loved his people to that extent that he wanted to see good for them. And that's the struggle that we have, is how to be righteous in a situation where our righteousness is depending upon us striving for Allah wa ta'ala. It's not depending on any environment that's created. Mecca wasn't an environment in which the Muslims had to depend upon the calling of the adhan. There was no open salah. It was an environment in which they had to be Muslim, and they had to strive to be Muslim, and they had to sacrifice to be Muslim. And in that environment, people began to see the change in people. There was nothing to lean on as far as, affirming your religious identity. And this is what we have come back down to, that we have become so comfortable. We lean on so many different things to support us in our religious identity that in reality, we don't have that sense of being empowered. And so that empowerment, we find that we have to get from building honest relationships with people. And we have to have that sincere relationship with Allah wa ta'ala, even if we have deficiencies, that we want good for others. And in that wanting good for others, there's a purification of ourselves. And we're not talking about having others convert to what we're on. We want good for others. We want others to have that process within themselves, not to force them to change to be like us, because there's a concept of self-righteousness that we may have. But because we want them to go through that process of change, because it's beneficial for them, because it's something that we find that Revelation has commanded to by the sending of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that revelation calls people to go through that transformation process. They have to go through that process themselves. They don't have to be a carbon copy of us. It's not about imitating us. It's not about us forcing this down their throats. It's about them going through that process of change, which allows them to be better people. But how can we encourage people to that reality where they start on their own journey if we have no relationship to them? Right? And how can we have a relationship with people if we're self-righteous? Right? If they don't see in us any real concern. We know many people like that claim religiosity, and that's a barrier between them and the people, because the people don't feel any connection. There's no authentic relationship. And like I've been saying, and I'm ending on this note, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made everyone have that understanding. It wasn't just a feeling, it wasn't an opinion, but they had a clear understanding that they were important to him. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam connected with people on that level, and they themselves, out of their love for who he was, began to change. And that's something that we wish for all of us, that because of the love that people develop for us, that they grow, and that what we give back is real love, so that they have love for us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.